Hello and welcome to another presentation on YouTube by the London Transport Museum Friends. 50 years ago, in 1970, London Country Bus Services was formed to take over London Transport's Country Bus and Green Line coach operations. We thought we should mark that event, and to do so, we've invited a well-known friend, Andrew Braddock, to return to our virtual podium. Before I hand over to Andrew, can I just say that if you are watching this during the premiere, then please ask your questions, leave your comments using the chat function. If you're watching at a later date, then please leave your comments again because we do welcome everybody's feedback. Andrew's talk on London Country is subtitled Created and Killed Off by Politics. So it sounds fascinating. Andrew, over to you.
Hello everyone and welcome to my second virtual presentation for the LT Museum Friends. This time I'm going to talk about London Country Bus Services. In 2020 it was the 50th anniversary of the creation of that organisation, separating out from LT on the 1st of January 1970. You'll see that I've subtitled this presentation Created and Killed Off by Politics, because I think almost uniquely we can say that about LCBS and not necessarily other transport organisations. The menu for the presentation is really to run through the history, how the new company was born, its fleet, the premises, the people, the money, the overall results, and the ultimate breakup. Not forgetting my small part in this one-act play, might even be called a one-act tragedy. Between September 76 and May of 84, I worked at this fine company, initially as Area Manager South, and then from early 79 as Field Operations Manager until I was sent to Alder Valley in May of 1984. Services in the area eventually covered by LCBS gradually came under the control of the London General Omnibus Company through agreements that they had with East Surrey Traction, which had been created a year or two before, and the National Omnibus and Transport Company. There was some competition from independent operators prior to the 1930 Road Traffic Act, which of course regulated bus and coach services throughout the UK. Some smaller companies were acquired by the LGOC and its associates before 1933, and the LGOC, interestingly, provided most of the vehicles and premises used both by East Surrey and National in the fringes around London. Green Line Coaches was established in 1930 and became part of London General Country Services in 1932. 1st July 1933, of course, the LPTB came into existence, taking control of the Underground, the LGOC, including LGCS, the Metropolitan Railway, and all the local authority and company-owned tramways. This was the map produced for the Act of Parliament that created the LPTB, the so-called special area, which existed from 1933 to 1970, and it really was quite extensive, going well beyond what we might even then have thought of as Greater London. In fact, if you look right at the centre of the map, the first ring dotted line is literally the boundary of the then London County Council. So what even then was considered London was extending well out into Middlesex, Hertfordshire, Surrey, and so on. So not surprisingly, the LTB special area was pretty extensive, including what became London Country. London Transport's Country Bus and Coach Department then set about compulsorily acquiring the remaining independent operators in the LPTB area. The fleet name London Transport came into use in 1934. There were a few experiments with using LPTB, but London Transport rang off the tongue much more succinctly, and of course we still use it today. The route numbering system was fairly quickly consolidated, and over time the routes in the northern half of the country area were numbered in the 300 series, and those in the south in the 400 series. Green Line Coaches, though initially given letters between A and Z, after the war became the 700 series, by which of course they're most well known. The key things undertaken by LT in its early days were fleet modernisation and standardisation. They'd inherited quite a lot of differing types of vehicle, although there was a degree of standardisation on the LGOC side. More needed to be done. There was a lot of investment in new garage premises, improvements especially in staff facilities, which had been pretty rudimentary, and there was the gradual emergence of better terms and conditions throughout the whole of the LT empire. Corporate design, the famous Frank Pick, of course, looked after that, and the first steps taken at marketing. Nationalisation came along following the unexpected Labour victory at the end of the Second World War, and the British Transport Commission was its creation in 1948, which brought in the railways, waterways, docks and harbours, road freight services, and the two, by then, major bus operating groups outside London, Tilling and BET. Tilling by then was practically 100% in state ownership, but BET started in that period with about 50% in state hands. The LTE took over from the LPTB, and that became the LTB in 1963. But throughout these different legal names, of course, it was the familiar London Transport. The Greater London Council was created in 1965, and as we'll see, that was to be a major influence on transport policy. So the rise and fall. The early post-war years produced a boom in bus and coach travel all over the country, and then came three lifestyle changes that significantly reduced demand. Television. It was commonplace, of course, especially after the Second World War. There was quite a boom in bus traffic, people going out to the cinema for entertainment. Television gradually eroded that. Supermarket shopping. Hard to think of it now, but we see this as very familiar. But in the 1950s, it was a rarity. And I think it was even in the 1960s before the first real supermarkets opened. But they had a significant influence because mums, occasionally dads, would go shopping 2, maybe 3 days a week. And then came the big one weekly shop, not least because the third issue, car ownership, made that more possible. And of course, rapidly declined bus use. In the country area, the decline from 332 million in 1955 to 198 million by the time LT handed over to LCBS was pretty dramatic. Only the new towns helped reduce the decline, and that was perhaps one of the fortunate foundings for London Country, that at least there were these places where some service development was still possible. Then we had the Transport Act of 1968, which of course created NBC, and that took over the assets of the Transport Holding Company, which effectively was the Tilling and BET groups. The remaining 50% ownership still in the BET group's hands had been sold to the state in the early part of 1968. Quickly followed by the Transport London Act of 1969, which transferred the control of country bus and Green Line coach services to NBC, and central buses in the Underground came under the aegis of the GLC. So we have another map, this time showing the new LT boundary from 1st January 1970, and you can see on the fringes of that area effectively the GLC with a few outposts. There are green dotted lines of country services going into the GLC and red dotted lines of central bus services, and of course underground lines in blue extending beyond. So it was quite a transformation from the LPTB special area to what became London Transport's area with the transfer to NBC. Interestingly, this new company was incorporated on the 9th of October 1968, and it was still then a subsidiary of the Transport Holding Company. Its shareholding was vested in National Bus when that started its life on the 1st of January 1969. Staff effectively were transferred from LT to LTBS, but they could opt to remain with LT. In the service area of London Country, very few did. But as you might expect, quite a lot of people from within the central services of LT decided to cast their fate with the original organisation. There was an initial period where central service provision from LT was very important. Chiswick and Aldenham still provided the engineering support. Payrolls and legal services were still effectively in the hands of 55 Broadway. The head office at Reigate, which had been constructed in the 1930s for the country bus and coach department, needed to be extended, not least to include what by then was probably quite a significant size of computer. I guess what those early computers were doing, you could now manage on an iPhone. And the search for a site for a central engineering facility commenced. This was always an interesting debate within the company because you were beginning to see the emergence of other parts of NBC with no central engineering facility at all, often through leasing vehicles, frequently through sharing facilities with others, and that was to be an influence on engineering policy in the later years of NBC. Firstly, looking at the people aspects, NBC decided that they would retain Geoffrey Fernyhough, who had been operating manager country buses and coaches since the mid-1950s, but as general manager, and to put over him a managing director, Cyril Buckley. Cyril Buckley had been traffic manager at Bristol and later general manager at Crosville, and was appointed in overall charge of LCBS when it commenced on the 1st of January 1970. John Robinson on the left was initially the deputy chairman. He was NBC's regional chairman for the South West and South Wales, and in the period from 1970 to 1972, I was working for him as his personal assistant. Always a great job to have, a PA to a chairman. You learn a lot and get involved in quite a bit of intrigue. So this was Geoffrey Fernyhough, very much the military man, TD for territorial decoration. You rarely saw him outside the building without his hat. He certainly enjoyed a very good relationship with staff. He was known across most of London country still as the old man, and he, I think, was a very respected character. And it was probably right that NBC retained his services, though I question whether it was sensible to have this sort of one-on-one relationship of a managing director, then a general manager, then the traditional bus company split into company secretary, chief engineer, and traffic manager. Confusingly, in the case of London Country, the title used was operating manager, which, of course, had been Fernyhough's title all those years before.
Perhaps to underline that military background, not just Geoffrey Fernyhough himself, of course, but the Country Buses and Coaches organisation, and indeed perhaps the whole of LT, was pretty militaristic. And I remember visiting Geoffrey Fernyhough with John Robinson when he was appointed deputy chairman, and JTE was a great character for looking at people's in trays and reading things upside down. And he smiled at Fernyhough and said, "Now, Geoffrey, I see you've got the commercial motor on your desk, and there's a circulation list, and it's got G. Fernyhough Esquire, HFC Adcock Esquire, G.E. Longley Esquire, then Mr. B.E. Speller, Mr. J. Turnbull." He said, "Well, what's the business of Esquires and Misters?" And Fernyhough kind of tweaked his moustache and said, "Well, John, you know, it's officers and other ranks." And I'd always remembered that.
So here we have the vehicle fleet on handover. Quite a sorry story, really. If you look at the second line, the average age was 18 and a half years. 721 double deck, 546 single deck, very few of them capable of one person operation, which of course was an increasing issue for the bus industry at this time. The RTs made up the biggest single group of vehicles in the fleet, and most of those were 16 or more years old. If you look back at the practices of London Transport in the run-up to the split, you could unkindly remark that quite a lot of newer green RTs emerged from Aldenham as red RTs, but I couldn't possibly comment. The Routemaster fleet, of course, we'll come to that in a moment, was pretty significant, though not as many as the good old RF, the standard LT single-decker. The newest vehicle types, of course, were the MB fleet, which were a bit of a mixed bag. LT had set itself on a path of restructuring central London bus services, which depended on so-called satellite routes, often using flat fare tariffs, standee desired of vehicles. They made a bad choice in the AEC Swift, though always called the Merlin by LT. It wasn't the most reliable of rear-engine vehicles. And at the bottom, of course, we have the smallest bus, the GS. There were 10 of those left. I think there were 84 originally built, and I always suspect that 92 of them have been preserved.
So here we see the inheritance of RTs in all their glory. I've always felt that the RT was the true London bus. I know what followed it, the Routemaster, became an object of devotion, but I'm an RT man. This really was the London bus, almost 7,000 of them, or maybe even more, running around the place in one form or another. Top left, of course, we see the typical Lincoln green livery, just with London Country fleet names, looking pretty tired. On the right, interestingly, there was one RT, I'm not sure why it was only one, that managed to get repainted into the lighter early London Country livery, pre-NBC livery, with the flying gun carriage logo, etc. It looked quite smart. The three at the bottom, of course, are three of the infamous, I think there were four, managed to get repainted into NBC leaf green. When I first saw one of these, which the engineers proudly presented to me, I said, go away and repaint it a proper green. And then I said, hang on a minute, perhaps it'll grow on me. And you know, I think it did. In a surprising way, the dear old RT actually looked the part in the NBC leaf green. It would have been awful if the white band had been removed, but it didn't live into that era. But they did look magnificent. And the reason we refurbished some RTs was that, in all conscience, they were generally easier to keep on the road than the remaining Routemasters. Once again, of course, we still had the conductors to crew them while waiting for ANs to arrive. And so they proved to be a pretty good stopgap. And I think the last of the refurbished, still as a training bus, probably lasted until 1980. So although 16 and more years old, they did pretty good service.
The little RF had been through the transformation in the late 60s, the so-called modernisation programme of RFs. So most of those inherited were still in, obviously, the Lincoln green. Gradually they emerged with yellow bands, and of course the refurbished coaches retained their pale green with dark green. And at the bottom left, we had probably the strangest visitation of an RF. This was one of the ones repainted into so-called leaf green, the NBC standard, but it retained some interesting bright work around the bodywork, so it didn't look quite as boring as some of the others. RLHs and GSs were well on their way out, even in LT times. The RLH, of course, required on low bridge routes, and the little GS for very poorly patronised routes in the most rural of areas, and they went pretty quickly. Routemasters were divided into three types: the RMLs with the standard open rear platform, RMCs and RCLs, both with platform doors for green line use. The RMCs and RCLs were probably among the most luxurious vehicles ever produced for London transport, and they certainly were a pleasure to travel in. The only modern double-deckers at the time of takeover were Fleetlines and Atlanteans from Daimler and Leyland respectively, XF and XA class. Top left, of course, is the standard Fleetline in Lincoln green. Top right, three of them, shortly before the transfer to LCBS, were taken up to Stevenage for the Blue Arrow service, a special connection between the outlying estates of the town and the industrial areas. And so three XFs were painted blue, and LT, bottom right, kindly gifted 3 XAs in their place, and they remained red until sale to China Motor Bus, along with the remaining XAs in the LT area, about 3 years later. Bottom left, of course, is the early, slightly lighter green that London Country adopted, still with the attractive canary yellow window band. The XFs, by the way, interestingly, were seen by LT as better than the XAs. So after the split, LT went in the direction of fleet lines, but London Country went in the direction of Atlanteans. The MB fleet, at the time of transfer, quite a few red ones were still running in the country area. The bulk of them, in fact, all of the country area fleets were 2-door machines. There was one oddball, the 2 pictures at bottom left, what became XMB15, and lived an interesting life on the local service at Tring between the station and Aldbury. XMB15 was swapped just after the split for XMB4, which eventually became MBS4. So that one, bottom centre, still had the original Strawn's bodywork, bit of a strange looking contraption, and it was very, very unpopular. We had to keep moving it around garages to avoid it being blacked by trade union representatives. Nobody liked it because it had a very low driving position. Sadly, the bottom right shows what happened with many of the MBs. They were increasingly unreliable and subject to a lot of breakdowns. The RCs were the fairly unhappy batch of Green Line coaches purchased by LT based on AEC Reliance with Willowbrook bodywork. They looked smart, but they really didn't run very well, which is surprising because in other fleets, the AEC Reliance generated a good reputation. And of course, originally they were in standard LT Green Line livery. To the right, an early NBC with a broad grey band and the DP style, dual purpose style of livery at the bottom. They saw out their days on the 723 from Grays into Aldgate and were replaced by the first Leyland Nationals used on Green Line service. The company developed a new logo, something different from the LT Roundel, of course, variously known as the Polo Mint, the gun carriage, or flying. I'll leave you to fill in the asterisks. But it did look good. I thought it was a very good representation of the area. The company was covering the sort of Polo Mint in the middle and the fields extending beyond. Nicely done. So let's have a look at the new fleet that came in pretty rapidly after the creation of LCBS. There were a succession of vehicle orders, some placed by LT, later by LCBS itself, to help modernise the fleet. Some were more helpful than others, it has to be said, but the key requirement at that stage was a rapid extension of one-person operation, and a step change in vehicle reliability was hoped for. So we had the SM. That hoped-for reliability was a failure. These were marginally better than the MBs. They always suffered the problem of having the smaller engine than an MB, and I well remember an Addlestone driver telling me after these had replaced the RLH class that he could get from Woking Station to Shearwater Estate in 17 minutes in an RLH, but it took 22 in an SM. So in his view, they were no good. They, on the one hand, served the purpose of extending one-person operation because these replaced many of the remaining RTs and even some of the route masters, but their reliability was certainly questionable. Then we had this interesting collection of Metro Scanias for superbus services in Stevenage, partly under the influence of the Department for Transport and the Development Corporation in Stevenage. There was a desire to have something a bit different, and the Metro Scania was seen to be the thing. So LCBS actually acquired 2 and then a further 2 in the early 70s and swapped 3 that were in the Hanson Dorset fleet as very unusual vehicles for them, which had been inherited with King Alfred Motor Services of Winchester. So those were swapped for LNs and transferred to Superbus as well. Then we had the SMs and SMWs. Interestingly, working as PA to John Robinson, I was involved in these and the SMAs, which come later, because the plea went out through NBC to other companies to help London Country in any way they could. That wasn't necessarily a call to dump old second-hand rubbish, but more to see if they really needed new vehicles that were on order. These two classes, which were South Wales Transport vehicles, the top left first three two-door vehicles with Marshall bodywork, had actually been in service in Swansea, but were hastily repainted and sent to LCBS. And the bottom right were the larger batch of single-door Marshall-bodied SMWs, which actually were delivered new to LCBS, but ordered by South Wales. Then we had the RPs. This was a combination, if you like, of London Transport and LCBS thinking. Green Line coaches suitable for one-person operation, with the aim of replacing the route masters to cascade those onto the remaining crew-operated double-deck routes to replace RTs. London Country had a big habit of taking pictures of new vehicles alongside aircraft at Gatwick Airport, of course. It was only just down the road. The insurance cover for these photo shoots was phenomenal, because we had to cover something like £1 million or £2 million worth of aircraft in case our driver reversed into the wing of that jet as he drove away. The RP, better than the RC, but again, a bit of a mixed bag. It wasn't the most reliable of vehicles. I think in many ways its problem was the nature of most Green Line routes being heavily trafficked, stop, start, going through central London, mixed with some fairly long stretches between stops of limited stop style operation where you could get a bit of speed up. And it not necessarily makes a good mix for gearboxes and certainly not for brake linings. The SMAs, another class transferred, or the order rather, transferred from South Wales Transport. 21 of these, Alexander bodied, quite attractive looking Green Line vehicles, but they didn't spend all that long on Green Line and eventually didn't spend all that long in the fleet. A derivative, of course, of the AEC Swift, longer than the SM class and single door. At least they had coach seat specification and were pretty comfortable to travel in. Spent most of their time on the 725, but eventually cascaded to bus work. Then came the ANs. As I mentioned, LT cast its fate with the Daimler Fleet Line, LCBS with the Leyland Atlantean, and these came in 5 batches, as you can see here. The original 90, top left, to an LT specification, including the blind display, you'll see, were Park Royal bodied 2-door machines. Top right was a set of 30, an order inherited from Midland Red, so they were slightly different MCW bodywork with flat windscreens rather than the curved, also 2-door. Bottom left were an odd 3. Never quite understood how this happened, but they were the tail end of a Southdown order. So to Southdown specification, the only vehicles in the London Country fleet with white window rubbers. Opinions vary as to whether those made the bus more or less attractive. These were also 2-door machines. And finally, bottom right, through the 70s was a long run of another 60 plus 110, initially Park Royal and later Rowe bodywork, looking exactly the same. The AFs were a class of Daimler Fleet Line, 11 vehicles, again a transferred order from Western Welsh. These were Northern Counties bodied, again quite useful vehicles, and they fitted well with the XF Fleet Lines, so allocation to East Grinstead and Godstone was to be their fate. Next, of course, we have the ubiquitous Leyland National. London Country had the proud honour, if that's the right word, of having the world's largest number of Leyland Nationals, eventually 543 in the fleet, not necessarily at one time. The first batch of 23 were 2-door vehicles, some in Superbus livery for the services in Stevenage, some in plain National Bus green for use elsewhere. Top right what do you do with a two-door 11-metre Leyland National you don't really want? Convert it into an information vehicle. So Infomotion, which I think was LN7, was a very good conversion and one of the first jobs done by the new Central Repair Works at Crawley. Bottom left, these were the real disaster. There was a batch classified LNC, C for coach, of course, but they were nothing of the sort. These had the standard Workington produced vinyl seats, absolutely dreadful, and they were allocated to a number of Green Line routes, but thankfully not for too long, because further batches of the shorter nationals with the C designation were what NBC would have regarded as DP, dual purpose machines with proper coach seats. Bottom right was the largest quantum of nationals in the fleet, the SNB class, both the original style of Leyland National and the B series without the roof pod in later years. Say what you like about the Leyland National, but it did bring us a much better reliability in overall terms. They were complex machines.
I can certainly remember in my time at Bristol when the first Leyland Nationals came into service there, finding drivers stranded around the city at night, unable to start their engines. And I'd learned that if I stood at the back of the bus and took off one or other shoe and banged the back panel, it would reset the micro switches. Drivers then looking in their mirrors to see my thumbs up would be able to drive the bus away. Wonderful stuff.
We mustn't forget this little batch, only 4 vehicles, the FT, early in the company's life in a project with the Ford Motor Company and the Department of Transport. There was a dial-a-ride service introduced in Harlow Newtown. It eventually became a standard local service with the branding Pick Me Up, not so much demand responsive. It wasn't a great success, but it was a step along the way of looking at these things in the early days of NBC, and London Country wasn't alone in running dial-a-ride type services at that stage. So the FTs didn't last very long and eventually were replaced by small Bristols of this type, BL and BN, L for long and N for narrow rather than W for wide, but never mind. These were pretty much standard NBC vehicles. Bristol LH chassis and Eastern Coach Works bodywork, very familiar around the whole of NBC. Top left is the wider version, and you can see that the trafficators and side lights are to the right and left of the headlights. The narrower BN, they sat above the headlights. Pretty reliable vehicles, didn't have a great deal of trouble with these, and they were ideal for replacing elderly RFs. The company in its early days was keen to exploit possibilities of private hire despite engineering problems and staff shortages, and I think quite rightly it was decided that some decent coaches should be purchased for this purpose. P's later ran into D's, and of course as Green Line was resuscitated, more vehicles of this style were available to underpin private hire efforts. It was worthwhile, and it certainly made some money for a company that desperately needed to make money. LS and LR types, these are interesting. The LSs, at the height of the company's vehicle problems, hiring in from various people. Some PD3s with Northern Counties bodies were hired from Southdown, and in some aberration between the two companies' managing directors, it was decided that it would be better and cheaper if London Country bought them. So there were these three PD3s at Godstone acquired from Southdown. They remained in Southdown livery, but with NBC-style London Country fleet name on the side. It is rumoured, I've never been able to prove it, that one difficult afternoon, the driver for the 709 Green Line, the last remaining RCL-operated Green Line route, only in the peak hours, came to take his bus up to London, found there was no RCL available. And one of those who'd been type trained for the LS, he ran a 709 journey with one of these vehicles. Could have been fun. Bottom right was a number of similar PD3s, but Birmingham bodywork bought from Ribble. Both classes, by the way, dating from 1958. And the LRs were only used for training, and they'd all gone by the time the real LRs came along. Then we had the aberration of a batch of Bristol VRTs, the BT class, inevitably. There were 15 of them, full height, pretty decent machines in some ways, and they were dispatched to Grays to operate the 370 long route from Romford to the town and some of the local services. They were reliable, but of course they were an oddball, and they had Leyland 510 engines, which was unusual for Grays and indeed for some other parts of the company apart from Leyland Nationals. So they didn't last long, and after about 3 years they were sold on 1980 to Bristol Oil and Bus Company, where they ran the rest of their lives and probably beyond. Then of course we have the RBs and RSs. We'll come to the revitalisation of Green Line shortly, but these were the latest style of AEC Reliance, bodied by Plaxton and Dupel for Green Line service. The engineers found they had a problem with what to designate these, because R for Reliance, P for Plaxton had already been taken by R for Reliance, P for Park Royal, and R for Reliance, D for Dupel couldn't be done because they hadn't got any letter Ds in the box. So they became R Reliance B Blackpool, where Dupels are built, and R Reliance S Scarborough, where Plaxtons are built. These were very good vehicles. They were all leased over a 5-year period. It's an interesting debate as to whether leasing vehicles, especially on frontline service, is a good idea. But the principle was that we would renew the fleet on Green Line instead of cascading older vehicles on and off. An unusual batch, creating a lot of comment at the time, were the RNs, and I can remember being involved in the acquisition of these because we'd gone to Surrey County Council and said, we could do some school contracts for you. And I can remember the County Council's then coordinating officer saying, oh, but Andrew, you don't do school contracts, which of course was a throwback to London Transport's days, and they didn't. And I said, well, we will. We need to make some money. The problem, of course, was that we hadn't really got anything suitable to compete with independent operators' quotes using Bedford vowels with lots of seats. So we gave the job to the managing director, Derek Fitch. We'll come to talk about him in a minute. And he gleefully went off and acquired 10 of these machines, which were R Reliance N Nottingham, because they came from Barton of Nottingham. Their USP was having 60 seats towards the rear. There were 3 seats, one side of the gangway and 2 the other, which was ideal for school contracts. Sadly, in the era of desperate vehicle shortages, it was never possible to keep these off either local bus routes, top left, or even Green Line duties, bottom right. They weren't terribly suited for Green Line, but they were probably a whole lot better than a bus-seated Leyland National.
So now we have the final batches of double-deckers delivered new to the company, at least for bus service work. The LR, pretty much the standard NBC bus of the day, Leyland Olympian. The first 60 came in 1982 with row bodywork, and the final 15 from 1984 with ECW bodywork. They both look pretty much the same. Again, a good reliable vehicle, the Olympian, and they lasted well into the successor company's reigns. Then we have the fairly magnificent looking LRC. First arrivals in 1984, sadly just as I was leaving the company. These, the first 5 at least, were dedicated to a new commuter route from Gravesend area into central London. It was an opportunity for Green Line to get into commuter coaching in an area where some settlements were quite remote from stations for commuting into London, and the railway service at that time on what became the South Eastern franchise was a bit ropey. So we were able to sow some good seeds there, and these ECW bodied, almost 12-metre long double-deck coaches in the so-called Venetian blind livery of NBC days, I think looked the part, and there were 15 of them eventually. on similar sorts of work, and indeed doing pretty good stuff on private hires.
Hired vehicles, this was where all the fun was. The dire straits that the company found itself in the early years of its life dictated a need to hire something from someone. Given that in most cases it was possible to bring vehicles in that could run with a conductor, there was no real need to worry about fitting ticket machines and all other complications. So here are the most famous examples, I guess, of the hired fleet. Top left is a royal blue coach, albeit in national livery, came from royal blue in the southwest of England. It's an MW, had a manual gearbox. So these were posted to Dunton Green for local services there. And I think there were maybe only 7 drivers at Dunton Green who had a so-called all types manual gearbox PSV license. And in my early months at the company, living in a hotel to the south of Redhill, I'd toddle around the patch in the evenings and I encountered one of these, found the driver had no idea how to get the machine into 5th gear, or more importantly, back out again. So I showed him, having trained myself on something similar at Bristol years before. And then gradually I worked through the other 6, and in the end we were able to reduce the running time between Dunton Green and Tunbridge, because they were able to go that bit faster with 5th gear. I jest. Top middle, of course, the redoubtable Bournemouth Daimler Fleet lines. On one occasion we even had similar looking Atlanteans come up from Bournemouth. These were posted to Leatherhead, largely on the 408 and 470 group. Top right is the infamous Daimler Roadliner, also from Bournemouth, only spending a very short time at Staines because they were even more unreliable than MBs. Bottom left, rather fine-looking AEC Regent 5s from Eastbourne. These ran at Swanley on the 477. And in the centre and bottom middle, similar liveries, of course, vehicles from Maidstone. The Atlanteans ran at Chelsham on the 403. And the PD3s were at Dartford on the 499. Bottom right, an exposed radiator PD3 from Southend, of course. Interestingly, these were initially hired by London Transport for use at Croydon garage, and they came to us afterwards and went to Harlow for the 339. It's always interesting to look at the advisability of hiring in vehicles like this, especially after the event. But as we got into the desperate need to improve the company's own vehicle reliability, it became clear that things like the SM fleet, okay, they were underpowered, they appeared to be unreliable, but there was a bit of a culture inherited from LT that if you didn't like a particular type of bus, you didn't find it at all difficult to stack them in a row and not use them. And I got quite interested in the engineering dimensions of this with my colleagues, and we found that it was actually cheaper to buy a lot more brake linings and oil filters, which are the 2 things that SMs consumed like there was no tomorrow, and keep the SMs running rather than hire these in. What you had to remember, of course, is that somebody had to pay drivers to go to Bournemouth or Exeter or Eastbourne or Southend to bring the vehicles to and fro. And of course, they were all on a pretty standard bus company hiring contract that said if you break it, you've got to fix it before you send it back. So financially, maybe not the best thing to do, but pretty desperate straits. Let's look at the premises. This was the crop of 29 garages inherited from LT. As you can see, most of them were pre-war, some of them dating back to East Surrey days, though there had been some investment in the 50s and right into the early 60s. Sadly, only 4 of those garages are still in use. The new Crawley is still used by Metrobus. Lees Road at Guildford, though heavily rebuilt, is still used by Arriva. Harlow also still used by Arriva, and Northfleet also by Arriva. The rest have all gone. The bulk closed during the lifetime of LCBS because if you spread those premises across short of 1,300 vehicles, it meant there was an average of about 40 buses in each place. And in some places like Luton and Tring, we were down to tens and twenties, and it wasn't really economic. There was also a significant problem, and who can blame them? London Transport, knowing from about 1966 that they were going to lose this lot, basically gave up maintaining them. We had leaky roofs, we had broken windows, we had all kinds of property maintenance problems, and the company hadn't got a property maintenance department until we created one. So it was an interesting mixed bag. Tunbridge Wells, though it closed in 1967, I've included in this list because there was an amusing facet to that. It was sold by LT eventually for development, more or less at the time of transfer. And there were factions within NBC who sought to argue that some of that benefit should come to LCBS. Sadly, they lost. This is the sort of thing that we had. Harlow was the newest construction by Country Bus and Coaches from 1963, and as I say, still in use. Reigate, very attractive property with the original head office. You can see sitting next to it on the left. These were good, solid architect designed structures from the 30s, 50s and 60s. But of course, the world was changing, and the latter days of NBC were looking at large open yards and maybe a small covered building to do vehicle maintenance. So complete undercover garages of this kind were going out of fashion. Some of the ones that closed, Dartford, that really was a problem in maintenance terms. We actually had to rebuild the roof there, and then not long after it was closed. Tring, of course, probably had a capacity for about 70 vehicles and ended up with, I think, 19. Chelsham lasted right through to the reorganisation of services on the LT-LCBS boundaries in the 1980s. Dorking, sadly, all boarded up there, long gone, and East Grinstead. So many of these were small, poky little East Surrey sheds. Many people still called them sheds, and some of them were kind of grand gin palaces, but effectively we had too many of them. Chelsham was always an interesting place, and to look at the premises, it was a little bit depressing because they looked so old and ramshackle and gloomy inside, but it was heart-lifting to see new vehicles coming to an old place like that, and they did make the best of them. So here's a batch of early Atlanteans delivered for the 403. Godstone is another East Surrey inheritance, and I've put there, would you want to show this off to the Home Secretary? Well, we actually did. In the Derek Fitch era, it was frequently the case that we would have visits by MPs to their local garage, meet the people, discuss the problems. So Geoffrey Howe, I'm not sure if he was a Sir at that stage, but Geoffrey Howe was the MP for the Godstone area, and he very enthusiastically came on a visit. He didn't come in the chauffeured limousine, he had his own large Jaguar, and he asked me when I met him on arrival where he should park, and I got him to park between the two garage doorways alongside those blue sliding doors, and that's just about enough width for a long Jag to fit. We then went inside to talk about company strategy, various other things, meet the people, see the workshops. Throughout the whole visit, a collection of both traffic and engineering staff at Godstone did some demonstration drives. How far could you reverse an AF or an AN towards this large Jaguar without actually hitting it? Squeal of brakes, hissing of compressor. And at 2 or 3 points in the visit, Geoffrey Howe said to me, Andrew, are you sure my car's all right there? And I said, I guarantee it, sir. And we continued. We then spent quite a bit of time in the workshops, and there was a wonderful fitter at Godstone named Pat. And Geoffrey Howe was genuinely very interested in what Pat was doing to rebuild an AN gearbox. And we probably spent 20, 25 minutes in this discussion. And at the end of it all, Pat beamed from ear to ear and smiled at him and said, "I don't know why you spent so much time with me, Governor. I've never ever voted for your lot." Probably the only time I've ever felt sorry for a politician. But these visits were worthwhile because it got us quite a bit of kudos among sitting MPs who understood the problems when we were rattling cages about need for new premises and new vehicles.
As a bit of a postscript to that story, we always had the tame photographer the company used on such visits, and here we see a couple of views, Geoffrey Howe in the cabin Atlantean, and pictured with the famous Pat during the discussion about AN gearboxes. I should add that after this part, Geoffrey was engaged in conversation with the garage manager, and I went into the canteen because I knew where the roads were. And I pitched in among them and said, "Okay, who won?" They all looked slightly surprised and pointed to one of them and said, Harry won." I said, "Okay, Harry, what do you got?" And he said, "£25, Governor." And I said, "Give it here," which he obligingly did, looking slightly nonplussed. And I walked back out into the workshop area and they followed me. And I looked at Geoffrey Howe and said, "Our staff here would like to give you this £25 for your constituency charity this year." And bless them, the bunch of hooligans standing behind me all clapped, and Geoffrey Howe went off with a big smile. I knew what they were up to.
So on to Derek Fitch. Cyril Buckley retired in the early part of 76. I think it was April 76 that Fitch succeeded him as managing director. A genial character by any description. I first met him when I went for interview for the post of Area Manager South in July of 76, so he'd not long been appointed. I actually went for 2 job interviews in the same week. One was to the post of Area Manager Thanet for East Kent Road Car Company, and the other, of course, was LCBS. And I remember a few days after the East Kent interview, the then general manager there rang me and said, "Andrew, we'd like to offer you the post of Area Manager Thanet, but you need to think about this. You have a young family, you need to consult your wife, you're moving halfway across the country, blah, blah, blah. Give me a call early next week." So I put the phone down and I rang Jan, my wife, at home and said, "We're going to Thanet." And I had to explain where Thanet was, but that was the way it was looking. No sooner had I put the phone down from that call than it rang again. And what sounded like quite a gruff voice said, "Fitch, when can you start?" And I said, well, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's between MDs and general managers of the respective companies, isn't it? Call you back." And he was gone. And I sat there thinking, gracious me, there was no, "We'd like to offer you the job," no mention of salary or any other things, just, "When can you start?" And of course I did, because I think I did the right thing. London Country looked a lot more exciting than East Kent, and I knew a bit about it, having been with LT in the mid-60s, and of course knowing the area well because I was actually born a Londoner. So I joined in September of 76. Fitch had been a career busman. He never went to university. He bothered the people at Crosville into giving him some part-time work, and eventually he joined them and worked full-time. Oddly enough, for a period he worked for Cyril Buckley. He moved on to Trent in 1956 as ATM, then traffic manager Northwestern, and then traffic manager Midland Red, where the then general manager of Midland Red, the largest BET company as it was then, and of course it became the largest NBC company, Donald Sinclair was the MD, and he said to Derek Fitch, "I want you to come and be my traffic manager and do to Midland Red what you've done to Northwestern." Whenever you spoke to Derek to try and find out exactly what that was, he couldn't remember, but he'd clearly made a name for himself. As NBC was creating the Central Activities Group, which of course led to all white coaches, Derek became the Express Services executive and was very much involved in the creation of the National Express brand and ultimately the seeing off of all competition on longer distance services. In 76, he joined LCBS, but moved on in 1982 to be regional director Southeast for NBC. And then latterly, his last job in NBC was as chairman of National Products. So he was kind of going back to where he'd started Central Activities Group. The then NBC chairman said to him, Derek, London Country, do something about it or close it down. That was the mantra. He was a devil in many ways because he had 100 ideas a day, and the trick was to run with the 2 that would work. There'd be all sorts of outlandish things. I can remember with my friend and opposite number, Alan Jones, who was area engineer south, we were taking him on a garage visit one day, and we went to Dorking. And it would be fair to say that the yard at the back of Dorking was an absolute tip. It was full of carcasses of RMs, MBs, you name it, bits of gearbox. It was a mess. So he gave us, to quote the vernacular, a bollocking, and said he wanted it cleared up. And then he put his hand in his pocket and he pulled out a cutting from the Financial Times that was eulogising about skateboard parks, how people were making money opening skateboard parks because it was a very popular thing at that stage, mid to late 70s. So we were bidden the job of clearing up the mess and opening a skateboard park. And he never ever forget things like that. So about 4 months later, we're back at Dorking. The yard is a picture. You could eat your lunch off the floor. Jonesy'd done a brilliant job of clearing out all the crap, but it was empty. And so Fitch said, where's my skateboard park? And I was able that time to put my hand in my pocket, pull out a piece from the Financial Times that spoke about the collapse in the skateboard market and how many people had lost money on it. At which he turned on his heels and said, lunch, I think, and you're paying. So his achievements at LCBS were pretty numerous, but certainly the renaissance of Green Line, which we'll come on to, would have been the major one. Restoration of service reliability, pragmatic stakeholder relationships. Through this, he had this genuinely inspirational approach and genial personality. You couldn't not like him. And that was true of the people we had to deal with. He was the first person I can remember in NBC to use that word stakeholder, because he genuinely saw the county councils whose areas we served and the district councils and the MPs as stakeholders in this business just as much as NBC was. So Green Line. It was a crisis point. The problems were pretty easy to see. Central London, congestion was manic. Congestion in some of the major towns like Watford, Stevenage, Harlow, Guildford were bad too. It wasn't uncommon to have Green Line coaches running 3 hours late. They appeared still to be providing the hourly or half-hourly service the timetable said, but bus for bus, they were 2 and 3 hours late. So this had massive impact on operating costs and staff attitudes. Generally, we had high costs from cooperation. There was a significant loss of traffic as BR was upgrading electrification of many of the lines around London, were key corridors where Green Line was in direct competition with rail. The image. Now, I've always argued, and I did actually manage to have this argument once with Geoffrey Ferniehoff, putting route masters, albeit with nice coach seats, onto Green Line, I think was a mistake. Little old ladies of Kingston saw a Green Line as a coach, and this was a double-deck bus. It didn't matter what kind of seats it had. Also, of course, the philosophy at that stage in the 60s, and it wasn't just London Transport doing this, it was happening throughout the country. If you could run a double-deck on an hourly headway, you'd have as much capacity to offer the public as a single deck on a half-hourly headway. And that was bonkers, because not many years afterwards, we learned, if we learned anything at all about bus operation, it's frequency that matters. Frequency, frequency, frequency. So knocking out 30 minutes to an hour with a more luxurious double-deck coach, I think was a mistake. The solution, obviously revise the network, cutting cross-London operation to avoid those desperate straits of 2 and 3 hour late running. New circumferential links. There were only 2 at the time of transfer from LT, of course, in the north, the 724, in the south, the 725, and make airport connections. One of the earliest things was to vary the 725, so there was a bit called 726 that actually went to Heathrow Airport, which previously had been ignored. Extending beyond the 1933 LPTB area was a really interesting part of the renaissance of Green Line. We knew that our adjoining NBC companies like Alder Valley, Southdown, even Eastern Counties, well beyond the LPTB area, were keen to work with us to introduce longer distance services. Hence, we began running to Cambridge with Eastern Counties, and a lot to the west with Alder Valley, and to the south with Southdown, and many other examples. Above all, the philosophy was to deploy some real coaches. How could we do that? Well, NBC could have produced any number of Leyland Nationals, or if we'd wanted double-deckers, God help us, any number of VRTs. But trying to get a coach out of NBC at that stage was difficult. Fitch sent me home one night with the Bible, a very large manual of the key responsibilities and powers of general managers of subsidiary companies. And I took it back the next morning, and he smiled and said, "Did you find it?" And I said, "I think so." "What did you find?" I said, "Well, I don't see anything in here that says you can't lease vehicles." He said, "Bingo." And that's what he did. A deal was set up with Kirby Central to lease what were the RB and RS fleets. And this made a huge difference to Green Line. Through the 50s, of course, and all really the history of Green Line from the 1930s, it was the spokes of a wheel running out through either side of central London, some really long routes, tracking from southeast to northwest and so on, which were very hard to run. And as I say, the spokes of a wheel, apart from two examples, north and south. But we took this through to a really good transformation. The notion being that you would have RS and RB vehicles. They later became TDs and STLs and all sorts of things. But the concept of vehicles spending no more than 5 years on frontline Green Line service was very important. We had a lot of fun with that transformation. We had a big celebration, of course, in 1980 of the Golden Jubilee. One of the, in fact, that's not an RB, top left, that's DV1. Fitch was in an interesting debate with Leyland, who were on the point of killing off the Reliance. So, of course, the arrogant view of the then British Leyland Motor Corporation was that we, London Country, for Green Line, would obviously take Leyland Leopards. So Fitch thought he'd put the frighteners on them and rang Sandy Glennie, who was the enigmatic chief in the UK for Volvo, and said, "Sandy, I want a couple of Volvos. What can you do for me?" And it was done. And I think DV1, DV2 came along, Plaxton body, very similar to an RB, but it did put the frighteners on Leyland. In the end, of course, we had to have what became the Tiger, which was a little bit better than a Leopard. So DV1 there in the Golden Jubilee livery. We published a book, and I was astonished when I scanned the cover of this book to turn it over and find it was only £4.50. We probably should have charged double. I don't know what you'd have to pay now on eBay. And on the right, of course, the Green Line coach guide, Golden Jubilee issue, with that lovely sunlit uplands, not to do with Brexit, but everything to do with Green Line. We even managed to win a trophy at the Brighton Coach Rally with a somewhat later Green Line vehicle. There's a bunch of the usual suspects there. To the left, Nigel Gray, traffic planning manager. I'm on the far right, and Alan Jones is in the middle, right under the vehicle's window. And to his right it would be, or left as the picture goes, Phil Carter was the guy who really did good work on private hire for us. So it was fun to win a prize. Obviously, beyond Green Line, there were significant changes in the local bus service networks in all the county and district councils served by LCBS, and the excellent team of Nigel Gray as traffic planning manager and Bernard Davis as commercial manager saw to it that there was very good input from those local authorities and significant consultation with local management staff. It's interesting that we, to my recollection, never had any disputes over service changes with staff at the garages. And in fact, we had very few disputes anyway. And that stood the test of time. Clearly, it was critical to move to 100% one-person operation with the new vehicles coming in. And sensibly, fare boxes were used on the busiest town services to avoid slowing them down. The big bugbear of the UK approach to what was then one-man operation in the 60s was taking the conductor's job and giving it to the drivers, which kind of automatically slowed services down by 25%. With fare boxes, no tickets issued, you could get very, very much more rapid boarding, and that was a help in retaining reliability. There was coordination between London Country and adjoining NBC subsidiaries. For example, on the eastern fringes, London Country took over some of the local services of Maidstone and District, principally the Gravesend town services, though I often wondered how the good people of Valley Drive felt when the 480 was famously extended from Denton, Milton, Ayleshades, which had been its terminus since the 1920s, to the Valley Drive area. So passengers were treated to a drafty open platform RML, replacing a rather more comfortable Leyland Leopard. But hey ho, it was the right thing to do. Some of that coordination was a result of the NBC market analysis project. For example, in West Surrey, a lot of service changes in coordination with Alder Valley. Equally in Buckinghamshire, in the High Wycombe area, also with Alder Valley. And these were sensible moves to ensure that the best was made of the network for the money that the local authorities were able to offer. London Country didn't undertake MAP itself because Derek Fitch always argued that we had our own mechanisms and we'd started the process long before. Surrey, interestingly, always took the view that they believed they got better results from working directly with London Country and indeed with London Transport on their eastern fringes, the corridor down from Croydon, though sadly that led to the 403 becoming an LRT bus service rather than London Country, but we retained the rest. And I think Surrey were of the view that that was a better project than MAP had been for them on their western fringes. The LT Fares and Services Agreement was a very important part of network reviews because from the split, we had arrangements with LT, obviously for coordination of fares on the common corridors in areas like Croydon, Enfield, Uxbridge and so on. And one of the key components of these network reviews was to try and consolidate vehicle types. At one stage, we had 7 or even 8 different types of bus and coach in a garage, and that's not good for overall reliability. So that was a key component of network review as well. Local authorities at 8 county councils were key to our survival: Beds, Berks, Bucks, East and West Sussex, Essex, Herts, Kent and Surrey. East Sussex was fairly swiftly dispatched. I can't remember how it happened, but we had a bit of a row with them over subsidy for the 409, which was our only service spilling into that county south of East Grinstead. So the 409 was cut back, and that was East Sussex. And of course, the GLC. Now, the GLC was interesting because they were very keen to see the retention and rejuvenation of Green Line, because they had a view that there should be some semblance of limited stop service across the GLC area. LT weren't terribly interested in that, up getting £1 million towards Green Line from the GLC, but it was somewhat reluctantly handed over from LT's coffers. But the GLC was important, not just in the context of Green Line, but also, of course, the services that spilled over into their area, and they could see that we were as good a provider, in some cases maybe a better provider, than LT. In these network reviews, there were some amusing things that happened. I mean, I can remember not long after I joined the company, I pitched up at Crawley, the pokey old garage on the London Road, and I sought out the chief inspector. I think Bill Moon was his name. And I said, Bill, I don't know how the passengers understand your local town service network. Oh, really, Governor? Why is that? And I said, well, they're all bloody 405B. And they were. Virtually every town service in Crawley, apart from the 476, was branded 405B. And in these shots, you can see interesting ways of displaying 405B from an RT top left through an RMC top middle to an MB top right, When the Atlanteans came along, of course, they had standard NBC 3-track number blinds. Fortunately, they were on the left side, always, I think, the wrong side. So the B could be incorporated in the destination blind. And then you had to be really clever with SMWs because the numbers were on the right. So this clever, not very clear device was adopted of having the 0 above a B. So you read 4 up to O, down to 5, and then to B. The reason, I'm told, that almost everything was 405B was that many of the services in the early days of the development of Crawley Newtown were run off the back of the 405, the main line from all the way from Croydon to Crawley. And that meant you couldn't expect drivers or indeed conductors to wind round lots and lots and lots to new numbers, which might well have been in the 800 series. So 405B it was, but it was a mess. Along came Sea Line, one of the great installations of the Nigel Graham Bernard Davis era at LCBS. We rebranded the whole lot, put it onto flat fare. The one mistake made was that on the right, everybody's letterbox in the town had this leaflet, chatty leaflet, telling you about the new services with a free ticket to use, 20p, a lot of money in those days. And of course, the population of Crawley went off in their droves to sample the new bus service. And they were told in the leaflet to drop their free card ticket into the fare box because these were fare box routes. Only afterwards did we learn that bits of cardboard, some of them which were probably soggy from the passengers' pockets or chewed in some way by the dog, didn't do fare box mechanisms any good. And yours truly spent quite a bit of time picking bits of card out of fare box mechanisms at Crawley Garage. But it was an absolute winner, and it was the right way to go. And many of these schemes, like Town Bus in Harlow and Watford Wide in Watford, some of them on the back of coordination with other companies like Chiltern Link in the High Wycombe area between LCBS and All the Valley, were really interesting ways of improving the lot of local services. So there was the transformation, its own special logo, a big batch of Atlanteans coming in to run the routes, pretty reliable, and that certainly stood us in good stead. Some interesting developments with county councils, in this case both Kent and Surrey, were keen to see Sunday services developed, and it wasn't always easy to do that on the back of an ordinary timetable. And of course there were different demands, and in both those cases there were discussions about having Ramblers bus services that ran 2, 3, 4 times of a Sunday, took an interesting route so that people could go off on a walk and a couple of hours later they'd catch the bus back to where they started. Quite a successful concept. So the results, years on. Well, there's no doubt that the company managed to vastly improve service reliability. It was unquestionably a problem. And in the early days, you'd go to any London country bus stop and you'd see a bus stop display panel saying, "We're sorry, we may not be able to run all of the service in this timetable." Pretty dreadful. But it was a combination of factors: unreliable vehicles, shortage of quality maintenance staff, shortage of drivers, even shortage of conductors at one stage, all compounded to damage reliability. But we were able to restore that. We survived the separation from LT in quite a good way, really, because London Country was able to pioneer things like the use of computers that hadn't really been done in the rest of NBC. We also resisted the pressure, certainly during the Derek Fitch era, to be just another piece of NBC. London Country was always able to pride itself on being different. Not LT, not LBC, NBC, we were London Country. And certainly this transformation of stakeholder relationships was very important. County councils, MPs, and so on.
We can have a look at some of the figures, the outturn results for the company, starting in 1976, which was arguably the first year after most of the major problems had been resolved in terms of reliability and service regularity. And you can see there was £21.3 million of revenue, but £28.1 million of cost, so a £6.8 million loss, and only £3.2 million of revenue support. So an overall deficit of 3.6 million. Come 1983, revenue and costs had both grown. It was a period of high inflation, don't forget. So 44.3 million of revenue, 53 million of expenditure, 8.7 million lost, but balanced, more than balanced, by 9.1 million of revenue support. So actually there was a small £400,000 round surplus for the company in that year. The first year it was in surplus. And don't forget that in the lean years, certainly 1970 to 76, there were mounting losses, and they were effectively covered by borrowings because the statutory requirement for NBC as a whole was to break even, taking 1 year with another. So that overall outturn in 83 was pretty good news. The 9.1 million of revenue support was the highest ever recorded within NBC. So I would regard that as a proud record, because in many ways that's the kind of money that needed to be spent by the local authorities to support the services which they wanted. And it's certainly fair to say that the counties we dealt with reckon they've got a reasonable deal.
Passenger numbers, a sad story, of course, from the absolute peak in London Transport days of 332 million passengers. It had fallen dramatically to 198 million in 69, to 154 million in 74, and 106 million in 85. Now, bear in mind those factors I referred to earlier: television, supermarket shopping, growth of car ownership. It's not surprising to see the numbers go down. Actually, if you look in the round at London Country's performance, compared with the rest of NBC, and indeed the PTEs in the big urban areas outside London, proportionally, our loss of passengers between 74 and 85 was less than the overall trend. Again, new towns helped. Also, Green Line Renaissance helped. So things were not as bad as they might have been. So, Transport Act 1985. This introduced deregulation of bus services, excluding Greater London and Northern Ireland, and of course privatisation of NBC and the Scottish Transport Group. Nicholas Ridley was appointed Secretary of State for Transport in 1983. His immediate predecessor was Tom King, and there was almost the point at which NBC thought they would get away with privatisation as a whole, like the National Freight Corporation, but Ridley was determined that it would be broken up. London Regional Transport was created before, of course, the abolition of the GLC, the Transport Bill published, Transport Act of 85. NBC sales were announced in early 86, including the mandate to break London Country and Crosville and Ribble and United up because they were seen as too big. And ultimately, the 5 parts of what was LCBS were sold. Northwest with 360 vehicles to its management, Southwest with 415, the largest number, to Draw Lane and Speyhawk. Interesting in this case, and later in Northeast, it was a bus group, Draw Lane, and a property company, Speyhawk, that took over. And Speyhawk, of course, were interested in realising the value of the properties, asset stripping, you might say. Gatwick Engineering, like almost all the freestanding engineering units within NBC, was sold to an outfit called Front Source. South East had become Kentish Bus, sold in 88 to Proud Mutual, which was the holding company for Northumbria, up in the northeast. And finally, Northeast sold to AJS, Alan Stevenson, who'd come out of the West Yorkshire Road Car Company and created a mini group, and Parktail Property Company. So all was gone. Hindsight or 2020 vision is a wonderful thing. Looking back 50 years, so many things could, perhaps should, have been done differently. I would argue that the line in the sand, as it were, between 31 December 69 and 1 January 70, when the world changed, could have been handled better. It was clearly going to be the case that LCBS didn't have a central workshops. That should have been thought about sooner and developed quicker. Whether Crawley was the right place or not, certainly some sort of facility like that, or better still, and I think interestingly, when we did radical things like recertifying RTs and putting them into leaf green livery at Chelsham, the work was done at Northfleet, Godstone and Garston, and to some extent Hertford. And those four could have been developed into mini central workshops facilities for the different parts of the company, rather than having one big central one. It's hard to say. Certainly, there could have been better preparations for the transformation, and a lot more thought should have been given to building up a modern vehicle fleet in the latter years of LT. Why should they go buying new vehicles for country services when they knew they were going to have the whole lot taken off them?
Of course, when it came to the decision to split London Country into four, in fact, strictly it was into 5 segments for privatisation. Obviously, North East, North West, South East, South West was the operating company, Gatwick Engineering for the Crawley workshops, and there was a new company created, Green Line Travel, which nominally was divided among the 4 segments. It's fair to say that really only North West made much use of it, thanks to the recently demised Clive King, who magnificently ploughed the Green Line furrow for many more years. It's also fair to say that towards the end of the life of the original LCBS company, under Colin Clubb, who'd become managing director after Derek Fitch in 1982, that there were a lot of opportunities taken to extend into London Regional Transport contract works. And that was good news and continued in the successor companies after privatisation. And I have to say that the whole Green Line renaissance, although it tended to shudder to a halt beyond privatisation, it did give birth, of course, to Speedlink Airport services, which Nigel Gray went off to run, and that really did some splendid work on those airport connections and really continuing the Green Line legacy, which was good news. Personal thoughts? Well, I suppose I thoroughly enjoyed my time at London Country. I think it was, in many ways, the best company I was with. It's sad that it ended up going to the Four Winds. It was a tough time. We had a lot of things to do in a very short time. We were helped to some extent by the ultimate reliability of the newer vehicles. There's no doubt that the Atlantean, in its original PDR 1A1 form, was still a bit of a bag of nails, but by the time from number 121 onwards, they became AN68s. That was a much better and sounder proposition. And the good old Leyland National, you couldn't really fault that. Noisy, pretty horrible looking thing, and the original plastic seats were dire. But in terms of reliability, those 2 types, I think, did more than anything to rescue the company. Also a word for the staff, because although we had some difficult and awkward trade union representatives, in the round they were helpful. We could talk to them, we could tell them the truth about things, and that didn't always happen in bus companies. And I said earlier we had little in the way of staff disputes. When we came to revising the operating agreement that probably dated back to London Transport Country bus and coach services in 1955, not much had changed. It was full of all kinds of weird Spanish customs. We got rid of all that in the late 70s, early 80s, and there was only one area of dispute. I think we had a 3-day strike at Windsor because they didn't like the idea, but they weren't backed by the rest of the fleet. Going back to Derek Fitch and his visions, I can't help thinking that if he'd been around at the time of the deregulation and privatisation experience for the company, he would have argued for the creation of a kind of regulated, semi-regulated buffer zone between LRT, and of course the whole of the rest of NBC subject to the deregulation rules. And I think he would have had a vision to create a joint stock enterprise owned largely by the county councils, who are, after all, coming back into the frame as a result of COVID-19, and will do as major funders taking over from central government to pick up the pieces and see how you continue to run buses after this massive decline in traffic. So that might have been an interesting experience. Last but not least, with a smile on my face, a final happy memory. On Saturday, the 1st of March 1980, we ran a final green Routemaster tour, and this covered routes 403, 477 and 480, where the last of the RMCs, RCLs and RMLs had been in operation. Everybody willingly paid £5 for a ticket. It was all great fun. Sadly, and it was the way of the world in London Country back in those days, on Monday the 3rd of March, Swanley Garage, bless them, managed to plate up and put out onto the 477 RMC 1512, which therefore famously became the last Routemaster to run in London Country. Two things about that. Number one, as of Sunday the 2nd of March, its ownership had been transferred to London Regional Transport, so we shouldn't really have been running it at all. It could potentially have been illegal. And yours truly got, I think I got letters from 7 people. Happily, it wasn't the days of social media. 7 people wrote in to protest and asked for their £5 back. So we sent them their £5 back, and I have a feeling we sent them a model Routemaster as well. All good fun.
So, last but not least, my thanks are due to Mike Harris, Michael Dryhurst, Barry Jeune, Tony Francis and Julian Bowden, who supplied most of the photographs for the presentation. Thank you and good night, or if you're watching at some other obscure time via YouTube, good afternoon or good morning.
Thank you, Andrew, for a very comprehensive and thought-provoking talk. It's a fascinating tale, and it's one which is made all the more vivid coming as it does from someone who was there and who lived through some of London Country's turbulent years. It's really good to have your recollections and hindsight on the record. Can I say to those watching that if you're not already a friend, please do think about joining us. It's a great way of supporting the museum in these still challenging times. Membership details are on the Friends website. So thank you again, Andrew, for your talk, and to everyone for watching. We will be back in the new year with some more presentations on a variety of transport-related subjects. Do please join us then.